Today we're going to take a look at World War One, its causes, the actual war and the fighting that takes place in it, and its effects. To start off with, we need to look at the causes, the driving forces that lead to this war happening, and those can be boiled down into four main things. First is nationalism, which we've talked about, which is an intense pride in your country, going so far as that you are willing to die for your country to show how great your country is. Second is imperialism, which is the idea that you want to acquire as many territories as possible. And the Europeans have been doing this since the mid 1800s, full on with Germany, Italy, Belgium, France, the UK, all trying to take up as much territory as they can in Africa and Asia. And most all the territory at this time is now taken up, so there isn't anywhere else to go and expand to. So now the Europeans are getting itchy to go and fight each other to show who's actually the best. Then to build off of this, you need a strong military to go conquer these people. And when other people around you are building up a strong military, you're going to build up a stronger military. And so that's called militarism. And the Europeans are building up and making as large of armies and navies as they can. And mainly we see this in Germany and Britain with their navies, and also just the German military in general being the most powerful one of the day. And so they're trying to make it as strong as they can, but they're also building plans or developing plans to take out each other if a war actually comes out, or comes about. So they've been planning this, and this is why when we see this war happen, Germany's going to strike first and try to knock everyone out, and unfortunately it doesn't work that well for the Germans. The last major piece of this is the alliances, which these are agreements between different groups, different countries to protect each other. There are two main alliances, and actually really only two alliances of this war, and that's the Triple Alliance or the Central Alliance. I'll probably refer to it as the Central Alliance just because it's a little bit easier to remember than the Triple, since we also have the Triple Entente. But that is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Italy, though, will eventually drop off of this and really not fight on the central side during the war, and instead the Ottoman Empire will jump in and Bulgaria will jump in. On the other side, in the Triple Entente, or also known as what is commonly referred to as the Allies, you have Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. Italy will eventually join over here. Japan will join in. The United States will join in. Serbia, who will be the original instigator, will be on this side, being protected by Russia. And you have many other European powers joining in to fight on this side against the Central Alliance. And these were kind of secret alliances, and what would happen is if someone attacked one of your buddies, you then would join in and attack the person attacking your buddy. And so that's what will happen here. We'll see happen here after the main cause. But here are a couple of political cartoons showing kind of how things work. On the one in the top right corner, you can see the arms race and the national movement blowing on the kindling that we're going to have of the alliances and the colonial rivalries and all those things. And the only thing we're missing is the actual spark to start this whole fire off, which will lead to World War One. And that is an incident that will happen in Sarajevo with the assassination of the Archduke, which we'll talk about here in a second. And that will lead to kind of a triggering of the alliances that you see over here on the left of, you got little Serbia that's going to be beat up by Austria-Hungary, which is then Russia's going to step in and beat up Austria-Hungary, which then Germany steps in to beat up Russia. And then the French and the British jump in to say, hey, no, you can't do that, and we're going to go and beat you guys up. So it kind of starts a domino effect here. And that cause, again, is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He is an heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne. And a guy named Gavrilo Princip, who is a young college student, decides that he's going to go and kill him while he's traveling through Sarajevo, which was a major Serbian city, and all to show that Serbs should have their own country. So we have nationalism coming up here again, and so he goes and it's unfortunate for the Archduke, but it really shouldn't have happened, but they made a mistake in driving around. After a foiled assassination attempt on their drive through Sarajevo, they go back the same route they came, which usually isn't a good thing, and Gavrilo Princip was still sitting there, and the car broke down right in front of him, or they stopped in a restaurant right in front of him. Can't remember which one off the top of my head, or sometimes the story changes and goes between those two. But he gets the opportunity to shoot the Archduke, and he first hits the Archduke's wife and then kills the Archduke. And The Austrian-Hungarians don't really like this and declare war on Serbia. Then Serbia has the backup of Russia, and we have all those alliances that I just talked about jumping in here. So World War I starts. This was originally thought of as being a very quick war. Germany thought they were going to go through and knock everyone out using blitzkrieg tactics that they did back in the early or late 1800s. When they beat up France and took all the territory and united Prussia. But there are new weapons out and new technologies that prevent this from happening. Instead, it goes to kind of a trench warfare style of war, which is a sitting war, and it becomes a war of who can take the most damage. And this all happens because of a one major development, and that is the machine gun. Battle tactics at the time were very similar to what you would think of as in the American Revolution or the Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars, where soldiers line up side to side and you march across the battlefield like that to go and take on the enemy. The only problem is now rifles are much, much better than they were before, and you have something called a machine gun that you can kind of point and spray, go down the line, and knock everyone out. And so they decide that we don't want to stand up in battle, and they dig trenches to protect themselves from the machine guns, but when both sides have dug in, it's very hard to get across what we'll see is a no man's land and go and take over another man's trench because they have machine guns there backing it up. And so this becomes a long, drawn-out war that'll last from or last 4 or 5 years, from 1914 to 1918, and it just becomes a war of attrition or a war of who can take the most damage. And you can see this in battles like Verdun and the Somme and Passchendaele, where you have armies losing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers just to gain a mile, and then lose it the next day or lose it a few days later. So it's not a good war. It's not a war like we've seen in modern wars with Iraq, Afghanistan. Even you could go back farther in Vietnam or World War II, which we'll look at later this week. But it's not like any of those wars. It's much, much different in that they sit down and fight in these long, drawn-out trench battles that lead to many people dying just of disease and other problems that are related to them fighting in this war. Some other weapons that come about, though, are poison gas, which really works well when you're in trenches, planes, which aren't effective yet, tanks, which aren't really effective yet, but they are a new technology to try to undermine or get around the trenches. But it doesn't have a major impact. It has some, but not a major impact like we'll see in World War II, or like you'd see in World War II if you look really deep at it. The last thing that we have going on with all this fighting is an idea called total war, where a country will mobilize everyone. They will mobilize all men that are fighting age to go to war. They will send all resources, all economic resources and everything to the production of military arms. They'll have major propaganda campaigns saying this war is great. And this works initially, but then when this becomes a long, drawn-out war, the people realize how bad it is and how many people are dying, and they've never seen a war like this. And so they keep fighting because they don't want to lose, but it doesn't become the war that people were thinking it was going to be. This major nationalistic war and everything is not what they were hoping it was going to be. And so people get disenchanted with it, and what we'll see happen is the Russians will leave the war. And we'll come back to this in a second, but I want to go and show you kind of the trenches here before we go to the Russians leaving. You can see a few diagrams here of the trenches. These were long, long lines of trenches, and you'd have one main line up front. If you can see my cursor here, you'd have this area up front. That would be the forward trench, and then you'd have 2 or 3 rows of trenches behind that, and these trenches would stretch for miles across a battlefield. And within the trenches, you'd have a dugout where you could hide out when shelling happened. You could poke your head out, but you have to be careful because a sniper might get you from the other side, because the other side's maybe 100 yards away, 200 yards away, sometimes over a mile away, but you're pretty close to the enemy. You just can't do anything because everyone's hunkered down in trenches, and it's a very dirty, muddy battlefield, and just not good fighting conditions to be in. So they fight in these trenches. It's horrible conditions, not fun. and the Russians get disenchanted with it and go, you know what, we can't take it anymore. They overthrow their Tsar, Nicholas II, and the communists eventually take over the country under Vladimir Lenin, and Russia will sign a treaty with Germany to get themselves out of the war called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which the Allies absolutely despise because the Russians weren't supposed to leave the war. They're now abandoning their friends, and this now closes a Eastern Front that was open. Germany had to fight on two sides. They had to fight against Russia, and they had to fight against France and the British on the west side. Well, now you've closed off the eastern side, and now the Germans can put full force on against the west. Um, and this was going to be really, really bad for the British and French. However, at the same time that this happens, the U.S. joined the war, or roughly around the same time, not the exact same time, but roughly around the same time, the U.S. will join the war. They had been trying to stay neutral and supply both sides, but the British had been putting a good embargo on or blockade on Germany, and so Germany wasn't getting those supplies. So they really just gave supplies to the U.S. or to the U.K. and France, and the Germans didn't like this, and so the Germans blew up U.S. boats that were carrying those goods, and we were kind of sneaking supplies in on cruise ships and things like that, like the Lusitania, which gets sunk, was a passenger liner, but it had a bunch of military supplies in it, and we acted very upset about that they were killing innocent civilians, and so they said they'd stop sinking U.S. ships, but then they continued it because we kept supplying the British, and they also sent a telegram to Mexico. Supposedly, this is more probably a UK propaganda, false information thing that they sent us, but they tried to get Mexico to go and attack us so that we wouldn't join the war in Europe, and in return they'd give Mexico their old territory back that they lost to us, like Texas, Arizona, Colorado, California, all that area. And so these two issues of the U-boats and the Zimmerman telegram become a tipping point, and the U.S. joins the war. With the U.S. joining the war, it becomes a change in the war, or it changes the wars from being a stalemate to being now in favor of the Allies, and the Allies will win the war with the help of the U.S. joining it. And so what happens is there's now a peace settlement. There's an armistice that is signed on the November 11th at 11 a.m. In 1818, but it will take another year or so, a little less than a year, to come up with an actual peace treaty at Versailles. And so during this time, President Wilson, who is the U.S. president, is saying that we need to not do a really harsh peace treaty. Instead, he comes up with 14 points. And some of those include no reparations against Germany or the Axis power, or not the Axis, but the Central Powers, end colonialism, try to free all the colonies, set up free trade networks so that everyone can trade freely with everyone else, create a League of Nations to prevent this from happening, and set up and don't allow any secret alliances, because all these things led to World War I happening. Instead, what happens is the British and French are the main thinkers on the Treaty of Versailles, and they say, no, we're going to blame Germany for the war because we don't like the Germans, and the Germans caused everything, even though, if we look back at the causes, Serbia actually caused the war, and Austria-Hungary caused the war, but the Germans didn't cause it. So Germany gets blamed, and this is a sticking point for Germany, and the reason why they'll come back in World War II really, really upset and trying to take over all of Europe. They also have to pay $33 billion, which doesn't sound like a ton of money today, but back then is a huge, huge chunk of money, and there's no way the Germans can pay it. So this is going to lead to their economy collapsing because they can't pay it, and they're going to just print off a ton of money, which makes it worthless. And then Germany can't have much of a military anymore, and the League of Nations is actually set up. So one thing from Wilson's 14 points is taken in, and that's the League of Nations. However, funny thing is the U.S. doesn't join the League of Nations because of political reasons between the Democrats and the Republicans. So that's the Treaty of Versailles. That's going to be a sticking point and will lead us into World War II. But there's also another thing that will lead us into, there are some other effects of this other than these, and there will be some other points that lead us into World War II. The other outcomes of this war are that, at least country-wise, politically-wise, Italy and Japan feel left out because they didn't really gain anything from it, even though they fought on the right side. Ottoman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire are dissolved. Russia loses territory because they left the war early, and new nations like Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Czechoslovakia, and many other Eastern European countries are created now because of this. But going beyond that, there's some bigger effects. For one, the feminist movement is finally able to be successful and gain the right to vote in many Western countries, Western European countries, because women showed they could pull their weight. They could do a lot of the work that was asked of them to do during the war. Because the men were away fighting, women got into the factories and did a lot of that work, and so they gained the right to vote from that. The colonies began asking for independence again. Um, they won't be successful in this, but they will start asking for independence again. And then after World War II, we'll see they'll start to be successful. But the bigger thing and the biggest thing out of all this is that a Great Depression occurs. Globally, it kind of begins in 1923 or so with Germany falling apart because they print off too much money, which makes their money worthless, and so people use it as wallpaper. Think of your wall being being covered in $1 bills, $100 bills, whatever, because it's just not worth anything anymore, and it's cheaper than actually buying wallpaper. Think about the wooden blocks you played with as a kid. Your parents bundling up dollar bills for you to play with and use those as wood blocks instead of the actual wood blocks because those dollar bills are cheaper. That's how bad Germany's economy is. People will go to the grocery store with a wheelbarrow full of money to go and buy goods because that's how much cash it takes to do it. So Germany's fallen apart. On top of this, the rest of the world will start to fall apart at the same time because um, no one's able to buy all these excess goods and crops, and so prices fall, and then farmers are out of money, and then jobs or businesses don't have money because they don't have money coming in, and so they have to lay off workers, and businesses collapse, and banks will collapse, and so this just causes a whole downturn in the global economy, except for in a couple of countries that are communist, like the Soviet Union. So people start looking at the communist form of government and economy as a better thing, but no one really turns over to it. Not many countries do. The only one that really will start pushing for that is China, but they won't successfully do that until after World War II. So with this unemployment, with all this bad stuff going on, this allows for the rise of dictators, which we're going to talk a little bit more about when we get into World War II. But groups of fascism or the Nazism or the Nazis to take over, so that they can revitalize the economy, which they do actually an excellent job of. Hitler was the Time magazine Man of the Year in 1937 because of all he did in Germany to revive the economy that had completely fallen apart. But at the same time, he's going to do some terrible things a little bit later on. But this depression allows the rise of these figures in their countries. And so this World War I, which I haven't brought up, was claimed to be the war that will end all wars, actually becomes a war to set up the next World War, World War II. Instead of this Treaty of Versailles being a treaty to end the wars that will end all wars, it is the treaty that will just postpone the next World War. And so this leaves the world in a bad situation, and it won't recover from this until after really World War II. And we'll see that next.